This episode is called Blood on Their Hands. In July of 1846, 28-year-old Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis reported to the Vienna General Hospital in Austria for his first day of work. Vienna General had been established over 60 years earlier in the 1700s. Dr. Semmelweis was proud to work there, and even more proud to be working in obstetrics, where he'd get to help expecting mothers. As part of his job, Dr. Semmelweis would work in one of the hospital's 2 maternity wards. Dr. Semmelweis felt optimistic, but also nervous. He'd only recently graduated from medical school and was relatively young for such an important position. But his strong work ethic had helped him rise through the ranks quickly, and he was determined to prove himself to his new coworkers. That day, Dr. Semmelweis walked up the cobblestone street to the hospital's double doors. He pulled them open and went inside, walking through the echoey hallways until he reached the first maternity ward, which was called the First Division. He wanted to make a good first impression on his new coworkers, so he smoothed out his mustache and straightened his jacket. Then he opened up the door, and what he saw next completely changed how he felt about his new job. A pregnant woman was kneeling on the floor, crying and screaming, but she wasn't giving birth. She was begging a doctor to let her leave and go to the other maternity ward, which was called the Second Division. The woman on the ground said she would do anything to be transferred there. If she stayed where she was sure she would die. Dr. Semmelweis had heard rumors about the First Division maternity ward. In fact, most people in Vienna had heard these rumors. There were whispers that the First Division was far more dangerous than the Second, that women who gave birth there were far more likely to become sick and die. Looking on from the doorway, Dr. Semmelweis wanted to rush forward and comfort the crying patient. But the other doctors had already lifted her off the floor and put her onto one of the many beds in the room, assuring her everything would be just fine, but she was going to stay here. Even though Dr. Semmelweis was technically in charge, he didn't want to interrupt what was happening. He still felt like he didn't really understand the dynamic of this place, and he needed to learn his way around the wards and win his colleagues' trust first. A few hours later, the same woman who'd been crying on the floor asking to leave the First Division went into labor, and Dr. Semmelweis supervised the delivery. And after seeing how scared this woman was, Dr. Semmelweis let the woman squeeze his hands during the delivery so tightly that his fingers turned blue. Thankfully, though, her delivery went smoothly and she gave birth to a healthy baby. But even though she and her child were okay, Dr. Semmelweis couldn't get the image of her crying and begging to leave the First Division out of his mind. The situation still made him very uneasy. He wanted to make sure women did not feel afraid under his care. And so Dr. Semmelweis made up his mind to learn as much as he possibly could about this First Division and see what was going on here. As afternoon turned to evening, Dr. Semmelweis pulled another doctor aside to talk about what he'd seen that morning. They stood in the hallway outside the First Division, their jackets stained with blood and sweat from a long day's work. Dr. Semmelweis told his colleague that they were both men of science. As such, he asked if there was any scientific proof that the First Division was in fact deadlier for the women inside of it than the Second Division. The other doctor said yes, there was scientific evidence that demonstrated that. He dropped his voice low, just in case any patients were in the halls, and he told Dr. Semmelweis the mortality rate for mothers in the First Division could be as high as 18%, but in the Second Division, it was much lower, only about 2%. Dr. Semmelweis was shocked. Those numbers meant that nearly 1 in 5 women died in the first ward, but only about 1 in 50 died in the second. Suddenly, that woman's fear from earlier in the day seemed totally justified. The other doctor explained to Dr. Semmelweis that the patients in the first ward seemed to be dying of something called childbed fever. This was a poorly understood illness that affected women who'd recently given birth. 1 to 3 days after delivering their baby, these women would develop severe abdominal pain and high fevers and would sometimes become delirious, and then they would die. Dr. Semmelweis's colleague stopped speaking for a second as another doctor rolled a woman by on a gurney. When she was back in the maternity ward, safely out of earshot, the doctor continued. He said there had been plenty of meetings at the hospital to discuss the differences between the 2 wards, but even one of the hospital's leading disease experts, a forensic pathologist named Dr. Jacob Kolechka, couldn't find anything to explain the vast difference in mortality rates. Dr. Semmelweis scratched his chin and glanced down at his blood-stained jacket. It really needed to be washed, and he really needed to get home and get some rest. He thanked his colleague for the information, and as he walked down the hospital's hallways, he thought over everything he just learned. Dr. Semmelweis believed it was his responsibility to figure out exactly why so many women were dying at this hospital in this first ward. He decided that the very next day he would visit the second division and try to learn what made it so much safer than the first. The following morning, Dr. Semmelweis grabbed a new, crisp white coat from his office and put it on. He walked down the echoey hallways toward the maternity wards, then opened the door to the second division. It looked nearly identical to the first division. Dr. Semmelweis took note of the same pale walls, the same beds lined up in rows, the same ventilation systems bringing fresh air into the room. However, the patients in the second division seemed much happier and more at ease. Dr. Semmelweis walked past their beds to the back of the room where all of the equipment used during deliveries was stored, and he began pulling open a few drawers. Inside of them, he saw stacks of metal forceps and scalpels. They were the exact same tools used in the first division. Dr. Semmelweis turned away from the storage area and back to the main section of the room, where he watched staff members bustle from one patient to the next. And that's when he noticed something interesting. There was one major difference that Dr. Semmelweis could see between the staff of the two maternity wards, and he thought it might be the key to solving this mystery. Several months later, the doctors and medical students who worked in the first division gathered in one of the hospital classrooms where medical lectures were normally held. It was a small space with wooden tables lined up in front of a chalkboard. Dr. Semmelweis stood at the front of the room, deep in thought, one hand nervously twirling the end of his mustache. Over the past few months, he'd gone back and forth between each ward, taking note of how the different staff members worked. Eventually, he believed that he'd gathered enough evidence to prove his theory, and so he'd called this meeting with everyone who worked in the first division to let them know what he'd discovered. Once everyone was in their seats, Dr. Semmelweis announced that he'd been keeping a careful eye on the first and second divisions, looking for something that could explain the huge difference in mortality rates. He said the two wards were similar in almost every way except for one. The first division, so the more deadly division, was staffed entirely by male doctors and medical students. The second division, the safer one, was staffed by female midwives. In the mid-1800s, when this story took place, midwives would have gone through an apprenticeship program, not a formal medical education. Because of this, they were considered less educated than doctors and wouldn't have been allowed to teach medical students. But since Vienna General was both a hospital and a medical school, it needed two maternity wards, one for doctors who could train students to handle pregnancy and childbirth, and another one for midwives who mostly managed the place themselves. For Dr. Semmelweis, the fact that the two wards had such different personnel seemed very important. Then Dr. Semmelweis said something that shocked this room full of doctors and medical students. He wondered aloud if maybe the midwives actually knew how to deliver babies better than the doctors. The doctors scoffed, and the medical students shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the idea that midwives might be more knowledgeable than they were. Dr. Semmelweis was uncomfortable too. It wasn't easy for him to consider that after years of medical training, he might not be as much of an expert as he thought. But Dr. Semmelweis didn't want to let his ego get in his way, so he pressed on. He told the men he'd noticed that women gave birth on their backs in the first division. That was a standard procedure for doctors, supposedly because it gave them a better view and more control over the birthing process. But in the second division, the safer one, where the midwives worked, women typically gave birth on their sides. This tended to be more comfortable for the patients and reduced the risk of injury. Dr. Semmelweis theorized that this difference might be the reason why so many women were dying in the first division. He told the doctors and medical students that moving forward, every woman giving birth in the first division should lie on her side instead of her back. Dr. Semmelweis watched the men murmur and roll their eyes, but he didn't react. He just thanked them for listening as the meeting ended. Then they filed out, leaving Dr. Semmelweis alone in the classroom. He exhaled, glad that the meeting was over. He still felt relatively new at Vienna General, and taking on this responsibility made him nervous. But he'd stepped up and done what he could to fix the problem in the 2 maternity wards. He left the classroom hopeful that this new change he had just implemented would actually work. Over the next few months, Dr. Semmelweis spent more time in the First Division, making sure everyone was following this new protocol by having the patients give birth on their sides. Now, there was not an immediate change in the mortality rates, but Dr. Semmelweis held on to hope that his idea would work eventually. Only it didn't. Almost every day, Dr. Semmelweis heard about or witnessed multiple women dying in the First Division. He had to admit that his theory must have been wrong. Even with this new policy, the mortality rate in the First Division was as high as ever. In February of 1847, less than a year after Dr. Semmelweis started his job at Vienna General, an average of 2 women died every single day in the First Division. Desperate to figure out what was really going on, Dr. Semmelweis spent his mornings in the hospital morgue doing autopsies on women who had died of this childbed fever. He, along with many other doctors and medical students, searched the women's remains for some clue as to what was really killing them. One morning, Dr. Semmelweis stood in the cold morgue, taking shallow breaths and trying to ignore the smell of death. He'd asked the hospital's disease expert, Dr. Jacob Kolechka, to sit in on the autopsy. Dr. Kolechka was tall, broad-shouldered, and clean-shaven, with dark hair that he kept combed to one side. Dr. Semmelweis saw him as a mentor and was glad to have him looking on. Dr. Semmelweis pushed his scalpel into a woman's chest and began dragging it down her body. He peeled back layers of skin, fat, and muscle, and he found the same thing he did in other women who had died of childbed fever, an inflamed abdomen full of swollen sores and pus. Dr. Semmelweis and Dr. Kolechka both agreed that these were clear signs of some kind of infection. And yet, neither of them could determine what exactly the infection was or how it was spreading in the First Division. Dr. Semmelweis set his scalpel down and rested on a metal stool. He looked around. He was surrounded by dozens of dead bodies of women he was supposed to care for. He had blood on his hands, literally from the autopsy, and also figuratively, because he clearly had not been able to prevent all these women from dying, and so he felt like he had totally failed them. Dr. Semmelweis stood and wiped his hands on his jacket. He then told Dr. Kolechka that he needed a break from this place, the morgue, the maternity wards, the entire hospital. Maybe a vacation would help him clear his mind, and he could come back and look at the problem with fresh eyes. Dr. Semmelweis took off his bloodied jacket, hung it on a hook on the wall, and then went to tell his supervisors that he was taking a trip to Venice. A few weeks later, in March of 1847, Dr. Semmelweis returned from his vacation. The time away had done him good. He'd been able to rest, to enjoy the museums and food that Italy had to offer. Now that he was back in Austria, Dr. Semmelweis felt reinvigorated. He showed up at the Vienna General Hospital for his first day back at work, and as soon as he walked inside, one of his colleagues rushed up to him in the hallway. The doctor looked pale and sad. He told Dr. Semmelweis that there had been a terrible accident while he was gone. His mentor, Dr. Jacob Kolechka, had died. Dr. Semmelweis was shocked. Dr. Kolechka had been young. He asked his colleague what happened. The other doctor sounded unsure as he explained it. Dr. Kolechka had been doing an autopsy on one of the women who died in the First Division. It was all routine. Some medical students were even in the room helping with the examination. Then one of the students accidentally cut Dr. Kolechka's finger with their scalpel, and the wound became infected, and a few days later, Dr. Kolechka was dead. Dr. Semmelweis swallowed the knot that was growing in his throat, and he shook his head in disbelief. The story was as heartbreaking as it was frightening. Dr. Semmelweis did autopsies all the time. He never imagined that getting a tiny cut during one of those autopsies could kill him. But while Dr. Semmelweis was obviously reeling from this terrible news, his mentor's death also made him curious. He asked his colleague if an autopsy had been done on Dr. Kolechka's remains. His colleague said yes, and said that he would go down to the lead pathologist's office and grab the records if Dr. Semmelweis wanted him to. Dr. Semmelweis just shook his head and said he would head there himself right now. Just a few minutes later, Dr. Semmelweis sat in his dimly lit office, poring over his mentor's autopsy report. What he found in those pages astonished him. The physician who had performed Dr. Kolechka's autopsy wrote a detailed account of what he had found inside the dead man's body. Dr. Kolechka's abdomen was inflamed and filled with swollen sores and pus. It sounded exactly like what happened to the women in the first division who died of childbed fever. This was odd because the medical consensus at the time was that only women who had recently given birth could contract childbed fever. But Dr. Kolechka's autopsy report seemed to prove that idea wrong. Dr. Semmelweis thought it all over. His mentor had been doing an autopsy on a woman who died of, apparently, childbed fever, and Dr. Kolechka got a cut on his finger, which then became infected and led to his death. To Dr. Semmelweis, only one possibility made sense. Dr. Kolechka must have caught childbed fever from the corpse, that somehow it got into that cut. Suddenly, everything clicked for Dr. Semmelweis. The answer to the mystery of the First Division was right there in front of him. It all led back to the morgue. Dr. Semmelweis knew that each morning, doctors and medical students completed autopsies in the morgue. He did it too. And like doctors everywhere in those days, they did their grisly work barehanded. That's why it was so easy for Dr. Kolechka to get cut. Then, after being elbow deep in dead bodies that were often filled with infectious diseases, they would head up to the maternity ward to deliver babies, often without washing their hands first. Looking over his mentor's autopsy report, Dr. Semmelweis theorized that Dr. Kolechka contracted childbed fever from what he called cadaverous particles inside the corpse he was examining. They were probably all over the unwashed hands of doctors and medical students who did autopsies each morning. Then they spread those particles to women in the First Division, directly causing the spread of childbed fever. And Dr. Semmelweis had a clear explanation for why the same thing did not happen in the Second Division that was run by midwives. Midwives do not do autopsies. So there was no way they would ever come in contact with any of these so-called cadaverous particles that could spread this illness. Dr. Semmelweis pushed the autopsy report aside. He jumped up from his desk and sprinted down the hallway to the First Division. His findings could save countless lives. As soon as he got to the first maternity ward, Dr. Semmelweis made an announcement. After completing their autopsies, all doctors and medical students would be required to wash their hands in a chlorine solution before they entered the First Division. Chlorine was one of the only known chemicals that could completely remove the smell of dead bodies from clothing, medical tools, and people's skin. Because it got rid of the scent, Dr. Semmelweis figured it would also remove the cadaverous particles that were spreading this deadly illness. And the results of this new hand-washing policy were remarkable. In April of 1847, the First Division had a fatality rate of 18.7%. By June, the fatality rate had dropped to only 2.2%, about the same as the Second Division. Dr. Semmelweis had just inadvertently discovered how to use hand washing to stop the spread of infectious disease. These days, we know the cadaverous particles he talked about were actually just germs. But this was years before the scientific community began to accept the idea that disease can be caused and spread by microorganisms like bacteria and viruses. At the time, the idea of hand washing with anything more than just water was totally radical, and Dr. Semmelweis actually faced a serious backlash for his suggested policy. Many doctors at the Vienna hospital undermined him and refused to follow his protocols, because according to them, doctors were gentlemen, and gentlemen's hands were always clean. Dr. Semmelweis fought back and actually ended up losing his job. And unfortunately, after he was fired, the hospital returned to its totally unhygienic way of not requiring doctors and medical students and everybody who's on staff to wash their hands. It would take another 20 years for germ theory to catch on elsewhere and for hand washing with antibacterial chemicals to become common in medical facilities. By that time, Dr. Semmelweis was dead. He passed away in 1865 after contracting a bacterial blood infection called sepsis, which, ironically, he got after a cut on his hand became infected. June of 2015, 30-year-old mother of two, Lisa Mackenzie, lived in what she called a safe neighborhood in Bridgend, Wales. One day when she was cleaning up her kids' toys in her backyard, she noticed something strange about her back door. She thought maybe one of her kids had taken paint and slapped it across the back door, or perhaps it was even mud. But then when she walked up to the door itself, she could tell that there were two very deep gouges in the door right next to the locking mechanism. Also, the key portion of the lock had loads of scratches all over it. Initially, she thought maybe these have been here the whole time and I just haven't noticed them until right now. But when she looked at the two gouge marks in the door, they looked fresh. Since she did not own a dog and didn't know of any other dogs in the area that might come into her property that could have scratched up the door, she figures, okay, it's gotta be my kids. So she calls her kids outside and she points at the marks on the door, and the kids swear they didn't do it. And they say, I don't remember ever seeing that. That's new. At this point, Lisa has this sinking feeling that someone must have tried to break into our house, but she doesn't want to scare her kids, so she tells them to go back in the house. They go inside and she's standing in front of the door and she's just looking at the marks thinking like, what do I do? And she notices in the bushes right next to the door, there's something silver sitting in the bush. She bent down and picked up a wire that she immediately recognized as a windshield wiper insert because she had recently had to replace her windshield wipers because one of the inserts was missing. She also noticed this wire that was very rigid had been bent up at the end like a hook. And it was at this point that Lisa went from maybe someone's trying to break in to definitely someone just tried to break in. They're using the wire from my windshield to try to defeat the lock. Lisa didn't make much money, but with the money she did have, she went out and got the most expensive, sophisticated surveillance camera that she could put on the back of her house to monitor that back door. And in addition to the camera, starting that night, Lisa began compulsively checking every door, every lock, every window, everything that could secure the house. She would check 3, 4, 5 times before going to bed every single night. And then the next morning, she would get up and she would review the footage from the night before. And for the next several weeks, no one tried to break into her house. There was no suspicious activity recorded on the camera. Everything was normal. Until Monday, July 13th, when she woke up and noticed her back gate, not her door, but the gate leading into her yard, was slightly open. Now, because she was obsessively checking every door, every window, every lock, that included that gate. Meaning the night before, she had triple checked that that gate was shut and locked. So for it to be open right now meant something had happened the night before. And so without even going outside, she goes right to her security camera footage, and she would say that what she saw made her physically ill. Earlier that morning at 1:15 a.m., an unknown man wearing a rain jacket and gloves walks up to the back of their house and puts his hands and his face right up against the window and starts looking in the window. And then he steps back, pulls a flashlight out, and starts looking in the kitchen with his flashlight, just brazenly looking in the house. And at some point, he puts the flashlight down and looks up and clearly notices the camera that she has installed. He looks at it for a minute and then just kind of shrugs and goes right back to shining his light into the kitchen before going around to the door itself and trying the door and fidgeting with the door to open it. It was locked. He goes to the window, he tries to open the window, it's locked, and he would make his way down the side of the house trying to open all of the windows until walking around to the back side of the house where there wasn't a camera. And then when he couldn't open any of the windows or doors because Lisa was diligent about locking everything, he must have just given up and left. Lisa's horrified. She gets in touch with police. She shows them the footage, but unfortunately, his face was kind of obscured in the video, and so they were never able to identify him. Here are the highlights from Lisa's security. On September 8th, 2017, 19-year-old Kanika Jenkins, along with her 3 friends, were driving to the Crown Plaza Hotel in Chicago, Illinois. It was a Friday night, and the girls had been invited to a big birthday party on the 9th floor of the hotel. They arrived at the hotel around 11 p.m., and by the time they got up to room 926, the room was packed with their friends, the music was loud, and the drinks were flowing. A few hours into the party, a witness would tell police that when they went up to give Kanika a hug, she could barely stand, she was so intoxicated. Another witness said when everybody was up, dancing and having a great time, Kanika was sitting on the side of the room, apparently too drunk to even stand up. At about 3 a.m., Kanika and the 3 friends she had showed up with decided it was time to leave the party and head home. So they make their way into the hall, security cameras would pick them up in the hall, they go down to the lobby, and that's when Kanika realizes she doesn't have her car keys or her phone. Her friends, who were not nearly as intoxicated as Kanika, told her to stay in the lobby. They would go back up to the hotel room and look for her things. Her friends go back upstairs, they search the room for a few minutes, and they finally find her purse that had her cell phone and her keys in it. They go back down to the lobby, and Kanika's not there. Now, they assumed she must have already left the hotel and was waiting at the car for them, but when they got to the car, she wasn't there. So they all pile into the car and they call Kanika's mother and they say, hey, we just left this party and I think everything's fine, but we can't find Kanika and we have her phone and we have her keys. And they explained that they had left the party and she'd lost them and that she was down in the lobby and now she wasn't here anymore. And Kanika's mom wanted to know, were you guys drinking? And it was clear the friends were a little bit cagey about it. And they said, oh no, maybe a drink or two, but I'm sure she's fine. Everything's just fine. And Kanika's mom just felt like there's something off here. It's the middle of the night. You don't know where my daughter is. And so she said she was coming to the hotel and she was going to find Kanika. Kanika's mom arrives at the hotel around 5 a.m. And the first thing she does is she goes in and talks to the front desk manager and says, hey, my daughter was here. They were having a party up on the 9th floor and her friends can't find her. I'm sure she's fine, but would you mind using the security footage to show us where she went? Because we don't know if she left the hotel or if she's still here. Would you mind showing us the footage? And the hotel was totally unhelpful. They were like, well, we can't show it to you unless there's an official missing person report. Which, by the way, is a complete fabrication. That's not true. They could have showed it to her, they just didn't want to. And so they told her, sorry, you're gonna have to file a missing person report. And so obviously Kanika's mother is very frustrated and she just wants to find her daughter. So she leaves the hotel and she calls police. And she asks them, can you please come down to this hotel and get them to show us the security footage because we can't find my daughter. The police were willing to help, but they viewed this as, your daughter was at a party, she's probably with her friends somewhere, she's bound to show up, she probably went to another room, and they advised her that she should just wait a couple of hours, see if your daughter turns up, and if she doesn't, call us back. Kanika's mom is now doubly frustrated that there's no one who's going to help her, and so she decides that she's going to search for her daughter on her own. And so she goes back into the hotel and she goes up to the 9th floor and she begins going room to room, knocking on every single door and seeing if Kanika is inside or if anybody knows anything about Kanika. And so for hours, her mom goes room by room, floor by floor, and is getting nowhere until at 1:15 p.m., this is now 10 hours after Kanika left the party and vanished, the hotel finds out Kanika's mom is going door to door and they call the police on her and say she needs to leave. She's trespassing now. Police show up to deal with Kanika's mother, who sees the police and says, can you please just ask them to show you the security footage? My daughter's been missing for 10 hours now. I have her phone. I can't get in touch with her. And the police say, okay, fine. They go to the front desk, they say, show us the security footage. They show them the footage, but it's just the exits of the hotel. And they see Kanika going inside, but they don't see anybody leaving. And I guess that was enough for the police and the hotel. And they said, hey, we did our job. She apparently is still in the hotel somewhere, but we can't help you anymore. And no one looked anymore at the footage. And so Kanika's mom is once again now not even allowed to be in the hotel and no one's reviewing the footage. And so she's got nothing she can do. Police would go back though that night at 10 p.m., so 17 hours after Kanika has gone missing, to review the footage again. And they start sifting through other footage beyond just the exits. And they discover Kanika stumbling through the hotel at 3:20 in the morning. She leaves the lobby and makes her way downstairs to the basement. She walks down the hall and can barely stand, and she goes into the kitchen. And then when she's in the kitchen, she kind of stumbles through the kitchen and then vanishes out of sight. When the police are not able to see Kanika on any other camera after she goes into the kitchen, they decide to just go down to the kitchen and look for her in there. And so at 12:48 a.m. on Sunday now, this is almost 24 hours after she's gone missing, they discover Kanika. She had stumbled into a walk-in freezer that was left open for reasons we don't know, and then once inside, she'd accidentally shut the door, but she was too drunk to open it up again, and she froze to death. Although Kanika's death was ultimately ruled an accident, one could make the case that had the hotel allowed Kanika's mother to review the footage just 2 hours after Kanika went missing, perhaps she would have found the footage that led them to the kitchen. They could have gone down and found her before she froze to death, but we'll never know. Here is the final footage of Kanika stumbling through the hotel before she ultimately landed in the freezer. In the early 1970s, a man named Marshall Applewhite was fired from his music teaching job for having an inappropriate relationship with a male student. Shortly after, he admitted himself into a psychiatric institution where he met a nurse who worked there named Bonnie Nettles. Both had a deep interest in biblical prophecy, and Applewhite, after meeting Nettles, was convinced they had met in a previous life. Nettles agreed and took it a step further, saying extraterrestrials had come to her and preordained that she would someday meet Applewhite. The two did not have a romantic relationship at all. It was strictly platonic. They bonded over a desire to ascend to a higher level of existence and ultimately reach the kingdom of heaven. Applewhite began calling himself Bo, and Nettles became Peep, and together they would start an infamous cult known as Heaven's Gate. The premise of Heaven's Gate was that an alien spacecraft that they simply called the UFO was going to come to Earth and whisk away Heaven's Gate cult members, elevating them to a new world and a better life that they referred to as Tela, or the evolutionary level above human. There was a catch though. Anybody on Earth who did not get on the UFO whenever it got here would be recycled, i.e. destroyed, along with everybody else on Earth, and then at some point a new human population would grow, and another UFO would come, and whoever got on that would be saved over and over and over again. That was just how it worked. And Bo and Peep were telling everyone they talked to about Heaven's Gate that we're already in end times. Apparently there were signs that this UFO is going to be here any day. And so now is the time to join the cult. And so by 1975, Bo and Peep had recruited 20 people to be a part of their cult, which meant they gave up their families, they gave up their possessions, they basically gave up everything in their life and moved to Colorado to live in total poverty as they waited for this UFO to arrive. For 10 years, cult members waited and waited for this UFO that never showed up. And Bo and Peep are aggressively reminding people that this is the path, you just gotta stay the path. And then Peep unexpectedly died of cancer in 1985, which really screwed things up for the cult. In their doctrine, it was destiny that Bo and Peep would get on that UFO and make their way to Tela, the evolutionary level above human. That was their destiny. And now Peep has died on planet Earth. She did not get on the UFO. She did not ascend to Tela. She will not get to Heaven's Gate. Bo was devastated and horribly depressed, and it wasn't really clear what was going to happen to Heaven's Gate. But he composed himself and he began to tweak his messaging a little bit. Bo began telling his followers that Peep had in fact ascended to Tela. Yes, she did not get on the UFO. However, the aliens must have given her a signal that if she leaves behind this human body, this mere vessel, you'll still ascend to Tela. Basically, he was preaching to them, if you just end your own life at the right moment, you can go to Tela too. But Bo didn't really know what the right moment was. He didn't know what the trigger was going to be. Until 1995, when astronomers discovered the Hale-Bopp comet was going to be passing by Earth 2 years later in 1997. And Bo saw this as the trigger. The UFO was going to be hiding behind the trail of this comet, and for sure, Peep was riding on that UFO, and as soon as it passes by Earth, we need to ascend. And so fast forward to March 26, 1997, as the Hale-Bopp comet passed by Earth, 39 of the Heaven's Gate cult members, including Bo, they began their journey. Bo told them they would be exiting the Earth in 3 groups. And so on March 26th, Group 1 entered their San Diego mansion and consumed applesauce mixed with barbiturates, followed it up with a whole bunch of vodka, and then put a bag over their head and waited for death. Then on March 27th, Group 2 entered the San Diego mansion, knowing full well what they were walking into. They all had specific jobs of how they were going to clean up the mess left from Group 1. They cleaned it up. Then they picked up the Group 1 members and placed them in beds and put a purple cloth over their face before they, Group 2, consumed their own applesauce mixed with barbiturates and put a bag over their head and waited for death. On March 28th, the third group entered the San Diego mansion, and this included Bo, and they did the same cleanup as Group 2. They put the Group 2 deceased members in bed as well, and then they consumed applesauce and barbiturates, followed it up with vodka, bag over their head, waited for death. Bo had given special instructions to 2 of the members that were within that third group to wait until he had exited Earth and take special care to put him in a specific bed, organized a certain way, and then when they consumed their own applesauce and barbiturates followed up with vodka, they should do that in their bed because they're the last 2. There's nobody else to move them. When a former cult member stopped by the San Diego mansion to check in on the cult, they went inside not knowing what they were up to and found all 39 cult members deceased, laying in bunk beds with identical black and white Nike running shoes on their feet with purple shrouds over their bodies, and they were all wearing matching armbands that read Heaven's Gate Away Team. Just hours before they exited the Earth, each of the groups would perform exit interviews where they would record themselves talking about why they were doing this, why it was important, and what they expected on the other side. They are remarkably cheerful and happy considering what they all know they are about to do. Here are some highlights from those exit interviews.
Okay, we have Thirsody with us, and I believe that you chose the name Thirsody because you wanted to be reminded of your thirst for next level knowledge. Is that correct?
That's right. I know my vehicle's, or this vehicle that I'm wearing is, pretty nervous, pretty scared. Some may say, well, boy, it's quite a irreversible step.
This isn't a troubling circumstance. Don't take it as that. It's just a gateway, just a doorway.
Okay, thank you.
Now you're going to find this old crummy vehicle in a bunk someplace that I'll probably be watching when you check it out and observe your responses and your reaction when you look at these vehicles. And they're all nothing but containers that we've used and board for the short amount of time.
People in the world who thought that I had completely lost my marbles. They're not right.